Church. It's good to see you here this morning. My name is Andy. I'm one of the pastors here, and some of you, you're brand new to the summit. If that's the case, love that you're joining us today. I know even I love what Jack shared just a few minutes ago, and I realize for some of you, if you're newer to our church, you're like, wow, it sounds like the 9 a.m. was amazing, and I missed out on all of it. Listen, here's the thing. I want you to hear from me today, particularly when it comes to the recognition of, I think God is doing some extraordinary things in our church right now. And I know he's doing a lot of things in your lives in particular. I mean, this is one of the privileges that I have just as being in the role that I am. I get to hear a lot of the stories, and there is just like so many different things happening in your lives right now where God is at work, God is changing things, God is moving in powerful ways. We love that. We're going to continue to ask for more, and I believe that he loves to do that. Now, I realize some of you might be in the room and you're like, that's not really my situation. That's cool that's happening for other people, but I don't really feel like that's happening for me, and I understand that. And I think actually, especially if this is your very first Sunday here, you're here at a really good time, because what we're looking at today, I think, will be particularly helpful for you. We're continuing through the Gospel of Mark. We've been teaching through this for the last few months, and every once in a while, you come to a certain place in the Bible, you read certain stories, and you're like, wow, I think I could actually imagine exactly what that must have been like. There's a certain parts of the Bible where you're like, wow, I know what that could feel like. I can resonate with that. Regardless of the distance in time and culture, this feels like I could understand this. And I feel like this is actually one of the stories that we're looking at today right here in Mark chapter 5, because what we're looking at is a story that's all about the timing of God. God's timing in your life. And the timing of God it's just one of those things that at some point, every single one of us has collided with, right? It's when you come to the place in your life when it's like, God, when are you going to do something about this? God, when are you going to fix this? God, when are you going to provide exactly what I need right now? God, are you going to do anything right now? I mean, I don't need this like next week. I don't need this in a month from now. I need this now. I mean, at some point, for some of you, I mean, there's the reality, maybe even some of you in the room right now, you would not even consider yourself very religious, but maybe it's the reality that at some point in your life, you've been the person who's prayed the prayer, God, I need your help. Like, I don't even really believe in you, God, but I am begging you to help me right now. And if that's you, if you've ever felt that before, that's what will make this story here in Mark chapter 5 so relatable today. Because Mark chapter 5, it's not ultimately about sickness. It's not ultimately about miracles. It's ultimately about what happens when desperate people need God to act immediately, and God seems to be working on a different timeline. Have you ever felt that before? I mean, I need God to do something in my life right now. Like I'm asking some big things from God, or maybe even asking some small things from God, but it seems like he's working on a different timeline than what I need him to do right now. We're going to see today that when God seems slow, it's not because he's indifferent. When God seems slow, it's not because he's indifferent. It's often because he's doing something deeper and something more important in your life that you might not see at the moment. All right, here's the reality. Like, you might not see those things in the very moment in which they're happening, but the whole point of what we're looking at today, these stories are going to show us that God is yet still at work nonetheless. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just jump into our passage today. We're starting in verse 21. This is Mark chapter 5. And here's what it says. It starts by saying this: and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. All right, so if you've been kind of tracking with us through the Gospel of Mark, you know that Jesus has been kind of jumping back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. He's gone from like teaching the Jewish communities to then teaching the non-Jewish communities. Now he's back teaching the Jewish communities again, and what we're seeing is that like Jesus is gaining a little bit of a following. Like there are people who are genuinely attracted to him, large crowds that are beginning to follow him, and then all of a sudden in verse 22, Jesus meets a man named Jairus. And right away, we're going to learn three important things about Jairus. Here's what we learn. First of all, he is a man of influence. All right, verse 22 says, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet. Now, we know that Jairus is influential for a few different reasons here. First, we get his position. Right, we're told that he's the ruler of the synagogue, which basically meant he was kind of like the president of the synagogue, and he's a man of great influence. He's a man of great leadership, probably a very tremendously moral man. But not only do we get his position and his title, we also get his name. Which, if you know anything about the Gospels, this is actually a very rare thing to get the name of a person who's been healed. It only happens one other time in the Gospel of Mark with Bartimaeus. Other than that, this is the only other time. This is Mark's way of tipping us off. This is a really important guy. All right? This is just like a really influential guy. So that's the first thing we learn. Second, we learn that he's desperate. He's desperate. Look at verse 22. It says, seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. I mean, think about what this is like. Here's a man of authority, a man of like great public standing, and he falls at the feet of a Galilean carpenter. I mean, that's a pretty unusual thing to happen, right? This would be like, wow, what's going on right now? You would watch this. If you were in the crowd there, you'd be like, this is an intriguing sight. Now, what it is really just kind of a reflection of how desperate this man is. My daughter is at the point of death. In other words, what he's saying here is, Jesus, unless you come, she's going to die. She's going to die. Have you ever been in a place of desperation? Have you ever been in a situation where it feels like, our only hope is a miracle? Like we need God to move right now, or we need something to happen. Some of you have been in that place. Some of you maybe are even in that place right now. I was at the emergency room just a few weeks ago with my youngest daughter. She's okay, but what happened? She was at the playground and she took a fall, busted her chin wide open, and I was so proud of her though. She literally she came home. She was at this park. It was about 1.5 miles from our house. She was with her older brother. They walked home. She was covered in blood, and she walked all the way home 1.5 miles. Came in the house, and I was like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And so I rushed her to Children's Hospital. We go to Children's Hospital, and you walk into that hospital, and the moment you get there, some of you know this. Some of you work there, and you just know. It is this heavy, heavy feeling. I mean, it's just like, everybody you're seeing there, like, you guys are desperate for a miracle. Like, you are so desperate. It's not hard for us to understand what Jairus is feeling in a moment like this. Many of you have been there before, a place of desperation. And he falls at his feet, at the feet of Jesus here. Now, this is kind of interesting. Because as he comes to Jesus, he comes to him and he's like, you can kind of imagine what this must have been like. As Jairus is making his way to Jesus, he's kind of like rehearsing his appeal. All right, he's kind of rehearsing his speech. Like, all right, here's what I'm going to say. Here's how I'm going to paint the picture. Here's how I'm going to make the ask in order for Jesus to come with me to heal my daughter. And if I word it just perfectly, maybe Jesus will respond. Maybe Jesus is going to help me out, right? And he gets there and he comes to Jesus and he's like, hey, my daughter's sick. And he falls at his feet and he's like, will you please come and heal her? And verse 24, what happens? And Jesus went with him. It's like, Jesus, will you please come do this? And it's like, okay, like, sure. Like, that's all. Like, he just says yes. Now, the reason why this is interesting, the fact that Jesus agrees to go with him, it's sort of easy to overlook the significance of what's happening in this event, because if we take a step back and look at some other ways that Jesus has done this in the past. In fact, if you were with us last year, you know that we actually taught through the gospel according to John. And in the Gospel of John, there's another event that's very, very similar, almost identical to this exact situation, except for instead of a daughter that was sick, there was a man who comes to Jesus, a royal official whose son was sick. And I want to read this. I want to read a portion of this story to you because I want you to see actually how Jesus responded in that moment in the Gospel of John. Here's what it says. It says, there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to Jesus and begged Jesus to come and heal his son, who was close to death. The official said to him, sir, come down before my child dies. All right, so it's like almost the exact same situation, right? Very similar circumstances. He's very, very desperate. Verse 50, Jesus said to him, go, literally, go home. Go home, your son will live. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. And as he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. All right, so almost identical event right there, except this time, Jesus miraculously heals a kid from a distance. All right, he doesn't even go. He doesn't go to the house at all. He just heals. It's like boom, and he's healed. Which just makes you wonder, It was like, all right, Jesus, if that's in your wheelhouse, like, why don't you just do that again? Like, why you don't even need to get up. Why not just say the word and be done with it? And the reason why is because Jesus knew, no, you need something deeper. You need something more. See, Mark is showing us something here in this story. He's showing us something both about Jairus and about Jesus. And in fact, this is the third thing that we learn about Jairus. Jairus believes in this very moment, he believes that his greatest need is the health of his daughter, right? But Jesus is beginning to show him, no, you actually have a deeper need that you're not even aware of. You're coming to me right now with what feels like the biggest thing in your life. And I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. I'm not downplaying it, but I'm trying to show you it's not the greatest need you have. Now, to be honest, that's actually how a lot of us first come to Jesus, isn't it? Right? You think about your own story, think about your own life. You even think about like what it was that maybe even brought you to this very church. We all tend to kind of first initially come to Jesus with some felt needs, don't we? You know, maybe it's like a relationship that's not working out. Could be a marriage that seems to be struggling. Maybe you just find yourself in a position of life where you're kind of like lonely or isolated, and you're like, maybe I'll try church. Maybe I'll go back to Jesus. I don't know. Maybe it's because, for some of you, maybe it's because of a bad breakup, right? Please don't raise your hand. But like, how many of you first came to our church because of a breakup, right? That's like half of our church, if I'm being honest. Like a ton of you came because of that very reason, right? And I love it. Honestly, I told somebody last week, I said, I am praying for more breakups across our city if that's what it takes to get people to come here, all right? And you know, that happens. We all come to Jesus for different reasons. I get it. Very understandable reasons, right? It's like, you know what? I've got a problem. Maybe Jesus will fix it. Or for some of you, maybe I'll go to church and meet somebody new, right? I understand how all that works. But here's the thing. Here's what Jesus, here's what Jairus, here's what the woman we're going to meet in just a minute are all trying to show us today. Jesus cares about every single one of your needs, all right? That's true. Jesus cares about every single one of your needs, but he is most committed to dealing with your deepest need. And because he is most committed to dealing with your deepest need, he will sometimes delay what you most want in order to provide for you what you most need. All right, I'm going to say this again because it's so important for you to be able to understand not just this story, but to understand your own life. Jesus cares about every single one of your needs. But Jesus is most committed to dealing with your deepest need. And because Jesus is most committed to dealing with your deepest needs, he will often allow you to not get what you want in order to provide for you what you most need. Now, when we look at this story right here, when we look at Jairus, I mean, you have to remember, if you were here last week, this follows exactly what just happened with Jesus and his disciples in a boat. And when Jesus was his disciples in the boat, I mean, there was this wind and the waves, this huge storm, the water was fun. They were about to drown. And Jesus was showing us in that moment that he loves you enough to allow you to go through certain storms in life so that he can prove that he is the Lord over all storms. It's a very similar thing that he's showing us here today, that Jesus is committed to your greatest need. Now, you can probably imagine how Jairus must have been feeling in this moment. It's kind of like it's two things happening at once here. Because on one hand, he must have been so excited that Jesus just agreed to go home with him, right? I mean, he's just like, man, this is like a Hail Mary. And I made the ask. Jesus said yes. Jesus is coming home. I'm so thrilled. I mean, he's so excited about this. And at the same time, his insides must be churning with all kinds of fear and anxiety that he and Jesus might be too late. It's like, what if we don't get home quick enough? Like my daughter literally is on the verge of death, and if we don't make it, then all of this is for nothing. And so Jesus and Jairus, they begin to hurry home. And they're followed by a huge crowd that's following. They're hoping to see another miracle. And then all of a sudden, Jesus takes a very unexpected pit stop. And this would have been a very painful pit stop for Jairus, wouldn't have been? All right, man, you think about it. Put yourself in that position. Be like, man, we got to go. And we got to go right now. Like, we got to get there. We got to get home. This is an emergency. But then Jesus stops. Why does Jesus stop? Because he encounters another woman who's in need. Now, we're going to learn a few things about this woman. In the same way that we learned 3 things about Jairus, I'm going to show you 3 things about this woman as well. The first thing is this: she suffered greatly. All right, she suffered greatly. Look at verse 24. It says, a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. Literally, the Greek there says that the crowd was so large it was crushing Jesus. I mean, you can just imagine what this was like. I mean, this is like, any celebrity walking out of a restaurant. The crowd is surrounding him. Verse 25, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. All right, this is a terrible condition. All right, I mean, I know some of you in this room you've struggled with chronic illness. You know how painful that is. You know how terrible that is. But 12 years, holy cow. I mean, that is a really long time. That's a long time to deal with a sickness. 12 years, I mean, 12 years is such a long time. Let's think about it for just a moment. Think about where you were 12 years ago. 12 years ago, it was 2014. Some of you were still in middle school. Some of you hadn't even got your driver's license yet. Right, 2014, some of you were still doing the ice bucket challenge and filming it on your iPhone 6. All right, 12 years, that's a really long time to be enduring something like this. But not only that, listen, not only does she suffer from her disease, but it tells us here that she's also been suffering from the cures as well. Verse 26. She says she had suffered much under many physicians. A lot of people think that she was actually being taken advantage of by different doctors. And she had spent all that she had, so that there's this financial burden on top of it, and was no better, but rather grew worse. And again, any of you who've ever dealt with chronic illness, you know exactly what that's like. It's like, I don't know, maybe this will work, maybe it won't, maybe it'll make you better, maybe it'll make you worse. We're not really sure. So this is a woman who knows what it's like to suffer. She has suffered greatly. The second thing we learn about this woman is that she was socially dead. Socially dead. I know that sounds kind of harsh, but according to the Jewish law of that day, this woman's condition would have rendered her unclean. Christy McClellan, she says this about that situation. She says, being considered unclean, according to Jewish law, had some real significant effects on her day-to-day life. She would not have been able to attend temple or synagogue. And this time and culture, that prohibition amounted to effectively being cut off from the religious community and teaching. God's people and God's house, places where we often find refuge and solace today, especially in times of suffering, were not a refuge for her. In fact, the religious community had effectively turned its back on her. She would have been considered on the outside of the social world. In other words, socially dead. Now, in addition to that, we also know just from history that even her family members would not have been allowed to touch her or to comfort her physically unless they would also want to be considered ceremonially unclean themselves, which means culturally speaking. I mean, here's what you just have to understand. Here is a person who's not only lost their place in society, but they've actually lost their place within their own family as well. Now, some of you know what that's like. Some of you come from families like that. Some of you moved to our city for that very reason. Right? The reason why you came to Denver is to escape all of the different places that you grew up. Like, here's where I'm starting over. Here's where I can come and do this again, and I don't really have that same connection to my family anymore. Now, the third thing we learn about her, this is probably the most important one that we'll see today. Here we see that here's a woman who wants Jesus, but I think she wants Jesus from a distance. She wants Jesus from a distance. Look at verse 27. It says this. It says, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him, which means that she's behind him. He's not able to see her. And she touches his garment. For she said, even if I touch his garments, I will be made well. Now, why would she say that? If I can just touch his garments, then I will be made well. Well, there are a few possibilities here. Mark tells us here that she had heard the reports about Jesus. You see that right there at the very, very beginning of the verse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, which might mean that she heard the rumors about Jesus being able to heal or Jesus doing these miracles. And she's kind of thinking, okay, I want to cash in on that. Like, I'm sick, I need some help. Maybe Jesus will help me. So it could be the case that she just heard those things. Or, here's the other reality. It could mean that she had heard the reports about Jesus as the promised Messiah, as the Son of God, as the promised one who had come to restore all things, to forgive us our sin and make all things new. Now, if that's the case, if that's what she was believing, like, you know what, I think Jesus might be a bigger deal than we think. I think Jesus might be our Savior. Here's what's really interesting. Can I show you just something really neat from the Bible that I learned this week? All right, Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4 is the very last chapter of the Old Testament. It was written about 400 years before Jesus was even born. And honestly, I never noticed this before until this week. Somebody shared this with me. But here, there's a promise within Malachi chapter 4. And the promise says this, quote, "There will one day come a son of righteousness with healing in his wings." A son of righteousness with healing in his wings. Now, the Hebrew word there for wings is kanaf, and it can mean wings, or it can also mean the edge or the corner of a garment. Kanaf, that's the word. So then fast forward 400 years later, Jesus enters onto the scene. Jesus is a rabbi, he's a teacher, and one of the traditional things that rabbis would wear are these robes with tassels on the edges of the robe. And that word for those tassels on the edge of the robe is the same word, kanaf. In other words, those are the wings of the rabbi's robe. So here's this woman, and we're actually told specifically in Luke's account of this story, she touched the edge of his garment expecting to be healed. So here's the idea. This woman, we can probably assume she's read Malachi chapter 4, and she knows for 400 years, her people have been waiting for a Messiah to come who would, quote, have healing in his wings. And so when she saw Jesus and she knew his reputation of one who could heal, she went all in on that promise and decided to take a huge risk, right? She's like, you know what, I'm going for it. Even though I've got all these things against me, even though there's all these reasons why I probably shouldn't do this. I'm unclean. I'm not supposed to be touching other people. I don't really deserve this. I haven't earned this. But here's my one and only chance. I am going to go for it. And that's exactly what she did. And look what happens there in verse 29. Immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Listen, I don't know what you're asking God for right now. Some of you might be asking for a miracle, right? Some of you just might be asking for healing. Some of you maybe are just in a place in your life where it's like, God, I'm asking for a tremendous amount of direction and discernment, and I'm not really sure what you have for me in this stage or season of my life. I don't know where you're trying to direct me right now. Some of you might just even be at a season of life where you're like, you know what? I have been praying that the power of God would break into somebody else's life that I know and love. I believe that God is powerful. I believe that God is alive, and I want to see him change this person that I know and love so much. And you're waiting for God to do that. Listen, what I hope maybe that you would just even take away from this woman's example, this anonymous, unnamed outcast of a woman, that you would see her example of courage, and that would encourage you this week. To be able to believe in the way that she believed. Maybe it's even the reality right now for some of you. God has been calling you. You know this. God has been calling you to take a certain step of faith, and you have been reluctant to do that. You've just been unsure. I don't know if I could do that. I don't know how to do that. And maybe God is even speaking to you today to say, you know what? It's time for you to take that step. And when you do that, when you step out in faith, you will meet a God who delights in honoring your faith. That's the story. That's the whole story of Christianity. Over the centuries, over all generations, men and women who take Jesus at his word and say, you know what? I believe you are who you are, and I want to act accordingly. Some of you, maybe you are in a unique season of life where God is calling you to do that very thing right now. Now we look at this story, and what's interesting here is something changes the moment that this woman is healed. Look what happens here in verse 30. Bless you. It says, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowds pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And it's basically like, Jesus, come on, we're in a giant crowd. Everybody touched you. And he's like, no. And he looked around to see who had done it. Verse 33, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now, the question that you should probably be asking in a moment like this is, why did Jesus ask, who touched me? Why did Jesus have to ask that? Was it because he legitimately did not know? Was it a mystery to Jesus? Was he trying to actually figure this out in the moment? Well, let me just say this. If you're a parent, you know exactly how this plays out. Because there are times, very hypothetically speaking, there are times that you might walk into the kitchen and you'll find that there's a jar of peanut butter wide open. And then there's also peanut butter kind of smeared across the counter because of the knife that was left out. And then you'll walk into your living room and you'll see your kids there, and one of them has peanut butter all over his face. And so then you ask the question, did anybody use the peanut butter at all? Now, in that moment, are you asking that question because you're trying to legitimately figure it out? No. Like, of course not. You know exactly what are you trying to do in that moment. You are trying to get that person to go public with what they have done. And that is exactly what Jesus is trying to do with this woman. He wants her to go public with her faith. He knows you need that. Like, he knows this is so important for you. You have to go public. You need to go public. This is actually just as important for you as is your healing. Why? Why would Jesus care so much about that? Why would Jesus make this woman do this? Because he knows there's actually something that is equally, if not even more healing when it comes to going public with your faith. I mean, this is actually a really crucial part to being able to enjoy God, to know God, to walk with God, is to be able to like go public with that. It's a very, very hard thing to enjoy God if you're keeping it all to yourself. You know, it's a very hard thing to enjoy God if you have nobody to share him with. If your faith is nothing but a very private thing, if nothing but a very personal thing, if you don't have anybody to kind of walk alongside in that, that's a very, very hard thing to actually walk with. But here's a woman, right? You look at the story, here's a woman, and she thought she could kind of just sneak in. You know, she kind of thought, like, I'll just sit on the back row, you know, like, I'll sit up in the balcony. Not that we have anything about the balcony people. We love you people on the balcony, all right? Yeah. But here's the reality. Like, she thought she could sneak in, get a little bit of Jesus, and then sneak out. Without ever connecting with others, without ever engaging Jesus personally. What was that? I'm keeping Jesus at a distance. And Jesus says, no. No. No, I got something better for you. I want to deal not only with your initial need, I want to deal with your greatest need. Verse 33, but the woman, knowing what happened to her, he came in fear and trembling, and he fell down before him. All right, now that's the second person that we see in the story that falls down before Jesus. And what does she do? It says she tells Jesus the whole truth. Now, again, Jack kind of shared this with you earlier, but this past Wednesday morning as we were gathered here, and we gather here every Wednesday morning at 6 a.m. to pray as a church, and guys, it is rich. I mean, I don't know any other way to describe it other than it's time when we come together, and God is not just answering prayers as we gather. God is literally speaking to people. I mean, he's been giving us these prophetic words for individuals and for our church, and it's just been such a powerful time. And so when we felt like, all right, like one of these people is in the midst of our prayer time on Wednesday morning, totally unprompted. All right, we weren't talking about Mark chapter 5 at all. We weren't talking about this passage at all. We were just praying together, asking God to move in our church, to move across our city. And when that person said, you know what, I feel like God is calling us to our knees as a church. You know, when I first heard that, I was like, okay. I mean, I don't really know what that means. You know, like I'm not really sure what to do with that in this moment. That sounds nice. It wasn't until a few hours later, though, I got to my office. I was at my desk. I was studying Mark chapter 5. I'm preparing for this sermon, and all of a sudden, I felt like it just jumped out to me, the reality, wow. Like, here are two different people literally experiencing the power of God in their lives when they get on their knees before Jesus. You see that? And they throw themselves, they literally physically posture themselves before Jesus in that way. And I told our church at the 9 a.m. gathering this morning, I said, hey, maybe that's for some of you today. Maybe God is calling some of us to get on our knees before Jesus. Maybe like that's just the posture he's calling some of us into right now. And I realize it's weird. I realize it's uncomfortable. We've got concrete floors here, like not the most conducive, except for in the balcony, right? In the balcony, you guys got the carpet out there. Like, listen, like maybe it's the reality. If you have enough humility to say, like, God is calling me to my knees in this season of life, to come before him in prayer, and that's going to be the thing that allows me to experience his power in very real ways. Listen, I don't know exactly the season that you're in. I don't know maybe if there's something that you're trying to, some of you, maybe just even a time of discernment, trying to figure out what's the next chapter look like. And it's like, maybe this is a word for you. It's not just a question of have you prayed about it, but it's like, have you postured yourself before God in such an act of humility to say, I am on my knees before God, asking for him to move in a powerful way. He loves to answer those prayers. He does. You get to verse 34, and look how Jesus responds to this woman. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." You know, why does Jesus call her that? Daughter. Here's a woman. Remember, here's a woman who's been ostracized and excluded, socially dead, no place in the family, no place in society. Here's what's happening in this moment. When she comes before Jesus, and remember it says she told the whole truth. What is that? That's what we call a profession of faith. Right? That's somebody who just comes to the place that says, you know what? Jesus, I believe you are who you say you are, and I believe that you're capable of doing what you promised to do. Man, you get to a place like that in your life. Like just that simple recognition. If you are a kind of person who's able to come to the place in your life where you're able to say, you know what, Jesus, I believe that you are who you say you are. And you're able to do what you say you're able to do. You believe that God looks at you, just the way that he looks at this woman, he calls her daughter, somebody who was previously excluded from the entire family. And he says, look, I'm not only providing you vertical healing right now, I'm actually providing you horizontal healing within the community that you now live. Right? She's been redeemed. She's been restored. She's been given a new family called the church that she's able to follow Jesus alongside. And it's only because she took that step of faith and went public. I hope that maybe that encourages some of you just to even be thinking about, okay, what is the way that Jesus not only wants to heal us vertically, but also bring horizontal healing into our lives? Now, you have to remember, in the midst of all this, as spectacular as that was, this amazing healing kind of comes out of nowhere. Here's this woman, unnamed, anonymous, and Jesus stops and he heals her and he does this extraordinary work. We can't forget about Jairus, right? Imagine how anxious or maybe even angry that Jairus must have been during all of this. It's like, Jesus, listen, I've got a daughter who's on the verge of death. It's an emergency. Jesus, like that woman's not an emergency. All right, that's a situation that could be handled for later, but this is an emergency that needs to be taken care of now. And here's Jesus just having this casual, unrushed conversation with the woman. He's like, who touched me? I go, no, I'm going to spend the time to figure out who did it. And, she comes, he has this whole conversation with the woman who's clearly not in the need of emergent care. And yet Jairus and the disciples, they must have been thinking, Jesus, what are you doing? Right? Read the room, Jesus. Right? If you don't hurry, we're going to be too late. I need help from you right now, Jesus. You've got to hurry. Jesus, you got to hurry. We got to hurry. But Jesus will not be hurried. He's standing there. He's talking with this woman. And the very thing that Jairus feared the most happened. Look at verse 35. It says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Can you imagine just what that must have felt like? All of the emotions that Jairus was feeling. Probably a lot of the emotions that Jairus was even feeling towards Jesus. But then Jesus looks at Jairus calmly, and verse 36 says, but overhearing what they said, or some translations actually say ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. In essence, Jesus says to Jairus, trust me. Right? Be patient. There's no need to hurry. Which is like the last thing that you want to hear when you're in a hurry, right? Some of you know what this is like when you're like some of you are like, you're in like a relationship with somebody who's, it's funny how God always puts people like this together. Where like one person's always on time and the other person is literally never on time. And you're like, hurry, we gotta hurry. And the other person's like, no, it's okay. It's okay. We're going to be all right. It reminds me, I did a wedding a few years ago, and the groom came from a family who, maybe just like the best way to describe this is like, time was relative to them. Right? And the wedding is supposed to start at 4 o'clock. We get there at 4 o'clock, and we're ready to go. The whole bride's family is seated there. Everybody's there. I kid you not, the groom's family arrived an hour and a half late. Hour and a half late. And you know, the bride's family, I mean, they're losing it. They cannot believe what's going on. They're sitting there wringing their hands. They're just going crazy. And then when the groom's family finally shows up, they show up, and they're so happy. They're laughing. They're so excited. Like, all right, let's get the party started. And everybody's like, this is so weird. Why? What is that? Time is relative, right? Every culture has a different kind of expectation for this is how we celebrate. This is what this means. Look, if there's one thing, particularly, I want to maybe even speak to some of you in the room, some of you who are older Christians, you've been following Jesus longer, you can attest to the reality, God's sense of timing will always confound ours, right? It's kind of the reality. His grace never really works on our personal timelines. And sometimes that's really frightening. Sometimes that's really, really confusing. Other times, you know, again, especially if you're a little bit older, you're able to kind of look back on the timing of God's provision and grace in your life. At some point, sometimes it becomes comical. It's like, man, I was so stressed out. I was so worried. I was so afraid. And God was doing all these things that I didn't see at all at the time. But he was so generous. He was so gracious. He was so kind in the way that he provided. Now, look at what happens here. Because Jairus, Jesus says to Jairus, trust me. Be patient. Like, there's no need to hurry. What is he doing? What is Jesus doing when he says something like that to Jairus? You know what he's doing? Functionally, he's basically looking beyond Jairus, and he's looking at every single one of us. And he's saying, all right, you remember how I calmed that storm? Remember how the wind and the waves and the water was filling into the boat and spilling over? You thought you were going to drown. And I showed you in that very moment how my grace and my love, they are compatible with you personally going through storms in life. You remember that? He's saying, well, now I'm showing you something different. I'm showing you how my grace and my love are compatible with what seems to you to be unconscionable delays. I'm showing what it looks like for you to have to wait. It's not like I will not be hurried even though I love you. That's not what Jesus is saying. It's more like he's saying, you know what, I will not be hurried because I love you. I'm not going to rush this. Like you don't need me. You don't need me to rush this right now. Like, trust me. My timing is so much better than your timing. You think you know what's best for you right now. You believe. I mean, gosh, we're all in this at different stages of life, aren't we? There's this time where, no, if God fixed this right now, then everything would be better. And what God is trying to show us is like, no, actually, I am doing something better for you. I'm doing something deeper in you that you can't see right now. Listen, Jesus will not be hurried. And as a result, when we think that way, when we kind of take onto that mentality of like, I know what's best, I know what's better, if only Jesus were to operate this way, you know what's happening? We're going to find ourselves, much like Jairus here, finding it very difficult to be loved by God. You're going to struggle to feel his love when you presume to know better. But look what happens here. I mean, we have the distinct privilege of knowing how these stories end. And the reality is, we know that precisely because of the delay, right? Because Jesus took his time, because Jesus didn't act immediately when they wanted him to act immediately, both Jairus and the woman, they got far more than they bargained for, didn't they? I mean, kind of the neat thing about this is when you go to Jesus for help, you're going to get far more. Actually, not only are you going to get far more than you bargained for, but you're also going to give far more than you bargained for as well. It's rarely the way that you expected. Take Jairus, for example. You know, he came to Jesus just hoping to get a cure for his daughter, and what did he end up getting? Well, let's look how the story ends here. Verse 37, it says, Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, that's Jairus' home, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. This was mocking him. This was not like, you're funny, Jesus, but this was like, Jesus, you're a joke. What is Mark doing? Mark is foreshadowing actually what would happen to Jesus on the cross, right? When they were laughing and mocking at him. It says, but he put them outside. Like literally, he kicks all these people out of the house. Right? That's a unique side of Jesus. Like, get out of this house. And he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in and where the child was. Verse 41, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Of course they were amazed, right? Again, they come to Jesus for a cure, not for a resurrection. But when you go to Jesus for help, he's always going to give you far more than what you ever bargained for. Jairus came to Jesus thinking, I just need Jesus to do this one thing for my daughter. But Jesus, what did he do? Jesus demanded far more from him, didn't he? Right? After his daughter died, Jesus looked right into the eyes of Jairus and he said, trust me. Trust me. See, Jesus was requiring something from Jairus that he wasn't expecting to give. Right? He came to Jesus just thinking like, hey, maybe you'll help me out. And Jesus is like, no, I'm actually demanding your faith. I'm demanding your trust in the deepest possible ways. Or you take the sick woman. Right? Yeah, she came to Jesus for healing, but she just wanted to touch and run. She wanted to say, okay, I'm better, I'm fine, I'm out of here, simple as that. But Jesus refused to allow her to do that, right? He's like, no, you have to go public with this. You need to go public. The moment that you go public, actually, that's when you're going to feel a fullness of your healing. It seemed to both of these people that Jesus was delaying for no good reason. In the same way that many of you have felt like that in your own life. Like it feels like Jesus is just wasting time. You know, it feels like he could do something right now, but he hasn't done anything. And you're tempted to ask the question, where is God? Like, why hasn't he fixed anything yet? Why hasn't he done anything about this yet? And the answer is exactly what we see Jesus do in these final two verses. Remember, Jesus, what happens here? He sits down beside the girl, the little girl, 12 years old. He takes her by the hand, and he says two things to her here. The first is Talitha. Talitha, Aramaic for the term little girl. But it's kind of like a term of endearment, and unfortunately, it's kind of lost in translation, like the weight that it carries. Probably the best way that we maybe begin to describe that today is like when a mother sits down next to a little girl and says, honey, honey. That's what Jesus says. And then the second word he says is kumi. Kumi just means arise. Right? Not resurrect, but like get up. Like get up. What Jesus is doing here is he's acting like what any normal parent would do, any loving parent would do on a normal sunny morning. Going beside their little girl and rubbing their back and saying, honey, it's time to get up. It's time to get up. And she does. She gets up. See, Jesus here, he's facing death. He's facing our greatest enemy in this life, right? The enemy that ultimately we are powerless over, the enemy that we ultimately can do nothing about. And yet Jesus looks at our greatest enemy, death, and says, you know what? For me, death is nothing but a little sleep. He tells this little girl in the same way that he tells every single one of us, honey, it's time to get up. Get up. See, what Jesus is doing in this story, he's not just showing us his power over our greatest enemy. You know what he's doing? You know what he's doing for you even today? He's showing you his distinct love for you. Right? It's when his power and his love both come together. In those very moments, you see, wow, this is someone who's not just capable of taking care of my greatest need. He actually loves me enough to go there. When you encounter a person like that, somebody who not only cares, but somebody who actually loves you enough to say, you know what, I'm not going to care just about your surface level needs, as important as those might be, but I am deeply committed to dealing with your greatest need. That is the moment that you begin to see the Spirit of God come alive within you. That's when you begin to experience the power of God, when you are able to step out in faith, when you have that courage, the same kind of courage that we see as this man, the same kind of courage that we see as this woman. They say, Jesus, we believe. We believe you are who you say you are, and we believe that you are capable of doing what you promise and delight in doing. When you get to that place in your life, you'll begin to experience the power of God in new and fresh ways. And let that be true, right? Let's pray. Father, we just ask right now, God, that we would continue to be the type of church where men and women, regardless of the season of life that they're in, regardless of what people in this room, even right now, this very moment, whatever it is that they are walking through, God, that you would, in your kindness, just invite us to take those steps of faith, the types of steps, even today, that would take us to a place where we actually get to experience your power. And not just your power, but your love, your deep love for every single one of us. God, we desire that, and we know that you love to provide it, and we have seen that so vividly even today. We're praying for more of it, though. God, we're just asking that your Spirit would continue that work and continue to call us forward and to trust you with the entirety of our lives, knowing that when we do that, God, you love to show up. So Jesus, as we move into our time of response today, our prayer in this very moment right now is that we would encounter you, the living God, that your Spirit would come close. Whatever healing that we need, whatever reassurance that we need, whatever, maybe some of us in this room today, the deep encouragement that we need from the gospel. Jesus, we pray that you would do what only you can do today. And we're praying this in the holy, faithful name of Jesus Christ. Amen.